Now, this particular build I first saw when Tarky was playing this very early on in the league. He was playing in solo self-found and he was doing a Seismic / Exsanguinate Trapper. Now, I don't know that he is the one that originated any of these ideas. I'm sure there's been build guides going around for this for quite some time, but this build has been catching some traction. Between people playing it in the Gauntlet and getting close to 8,000 effective health pool, people like Path of Math doing showcases of very high-end bosses with a relatively low life, but showing that you can do it on very low gear, this build has been an absolute monster. So I decided that we'd give some time and try it out and see what happened at different levels of investment. Now, if you're not aware, the Workshop series is a series of videos where I go through and kind of give you guys an idea of what happens over at my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/bigducks, which you should go follow, by the way, where we go through, we test all of these builds, we see how they perform at different levels of budget, and kind of, decide if the build is worthwhile to make a build guide out of. The first step is I tend to do a budget gear level of 1x or less, and then we move on to low investment, which is 5 Exalt, mid investment, which is 10 Exalt, high investment, which is 20 Exalt, and then anything above that would be considered insane investment. So now with the Seismic Trapper, we are mainly going to be just scaling the gem level of Seismic Trap, and then using Exsanguinate is just a good spell to be clearing maps with. So our goal at the budget level of gear for this build is going to be just finding a bunch of cheap rares to fill in slots. We're looking for a rare helmet base with Seismic Trap releases an additional wave, and then crafting it with something like essences if we can. That may not be available. If so, just buy a normal helmet. The uniques that we'll be looking for are 2 cold iron points. You can use obliteration wands if this is maybe early on in the league and you're watching this video. They will work initially just to give you some extra damage, but you do want to upgrade to cold iron points as soon as you can. They are a huge boost to damage for this build. Just keep in mind, at a league start scenario, they may be a little expensive if this build is popular. The next thing we're looking for is either a Tabula Rasa with a +2 corruption of either AoE or Trap and Mine. Trap and Mine is going to be ideal here as it will affect more gems in the actual links, or we can be using a 6-link corrupted chest piece with the correct colors. And then the last unique that we're using is a pair of Deer Stalkers to slot our Exsanguinate into early on. You can get a +1 level of gems corruption here if you find one available. Now the build at this level of gear is able to pump out an absolute ridiculous amount of damage. With current prices at around 1 Exalt, you can get a ton of power. Now that damage is going to come out a little bit slower than in the final build, but it still does a ridiculous amount of damage. I was able to comfortably kill Awakener 8, Tier 15 and 16 Conquerors, and clear higher tier red maps without too many problems at all. Now I mentioned this earlier, but there is a additional version of this build that uses cold conversion with the Gale Sight helmet to inflict brittle. This was showcased by Path of Math recently. However, I have decided to avoid this for now, just because of the potential for brittle to be nerfed next patch. I do think that there is a chance that they might cap brittle or nerf it in some way, just because of the ridiculous amount of damage that you can obtain for seemingly very little investment. Now moving on to the low investment. This is where we're going to be trying to pick up a 6-link Tinker Skin. Now depending on the current state of the league that you're watching this in, the chest piece could be anywhere from like 2 to 3 Exalt upwards to 6 or maybe more Exalt. Currently, right now, it is roughly 3 Exalt for a 6-link version, so just keep that in mind. We are also going to be trying to pick up a pair of Atziri's Steps. Now, these are only going to be possible to be switched into after we swap into the rare Trap Gloves. Now, these Trap Gloves that we're looking for are going to be a pair of Shaper Gloves with a minimum eye level of 80. You can simply buy any gloves with the gems are supported by Trap support, or you can attempt to roll these yourself. Now, keep in mind here that the links that we are going to be putting in this are red, 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 green, so if you buy Energy Shield base of these, it's going to be very difficult to get the correct colors on. You'll have to do the Varici method over on the bench. Now, essences work extremely well to craft these. You can use life or resist-based essences, and there are other trap supports that are possible here. However, for our purposes, we are only going to be looking for the trap support at this point. Now, it is possible that you can roll significantly better gloves here with like crit multi-percentage and all kinds of crazy stuff, but I will talk about those way later in the insane investment tier because they can get a little expensive. Now, once you have those gloves, you can easily put on Atziri's Step or maybe some rare boots if you can't find anything else. And this is the point where if you can obtain a +1 to Fizz amulet with any other decent stats and no other Conqueror modifiers, that would be ideal because we can use this as fodder for crafting a +1/+1 amulet later on in the gear. Now, if you can get a Vuln on hit ring, it is quite a big upgrade for this build, and just so you are aware, you can apply vulnerability on hit with your traps. So with Exsanguinate, you are going to be vulning essentially the entire screen whenever you're throwing them. This is the point where if you weren't able to find that Seismic Trap enchanted helmet, that you should try to get it now. Now, this is where I personally feel the build hits its peak usefulness when it comes to investment versus what you get get out of it. The Tinker Skin upgrade feels absolutely amazing as it provides us a source of sustain as well as some phasing for when our flask is down. Being able to swap out of the deerskin boots for a pair of trap gloves, it allows us to use those at Zeri Steps I talked about earlier, and at this level of gear I was able to do the vast majority of content in the game comfortably, and with good play of a good player you can probably accomplish all content in the game at this level of gear. Now the next upgrade is going to be a single upgrade moving us into the mid investment, which is 10 Exalt. This is going to be crafting a +1/+1 Dex Fizz amulet. Now this may be cheaper in the future, but at current prices this amulet costs me close to 7 Exalt to craft. That being said, Seismic Trap does scale insanely well with levels, and the +1/+1 amulet is an amazing upgrade. Keep in mind that with this amulet upgrade, this is where we are going to hit the peak of our defensive stats. Everything beyond here is going to make the build squishier, but that being said, a ton of damage does await us going forward. So at the 10 Exalt level, this is where you're probably going to get the tankiest that you'll ever be. And if you did incorporate that +1 Fizz amulet from before, you might be able to make this step a little bit cheaper. Now moving on into high investment. This is where we're at around 20 Exalt, and this is where my build kind of capped out. This is where we're going to start getting cluster jewels and adjusting our tree. I'll show you the trees that we used later on in the video, but the idea here is that we're going to be swapping into 2 large physical cluster jewels and 4 mediums. Now the mediums can be an assortment of either trap and mine or crit clusters. I would say that if you are not ready to go crit and you are just initially getting into it, trap and mine clusters can be quite good. Some of them can have life nodes on them, so if you go all trap and mine clusters, you can keep some of that tankiness that you had before, but you're going to be sacrificing a lot of damage, as crit clusters are going to be some of our main sources of crit going forward. Beyond that, we're going to be using a replica cheap construction. This gives us a ton of crit, and we only sacrifice a little bit of traps to get this, and honestly, the maximum amount of traps is not that important for when you're doing bosses. We can only really have 4 or 5 seismic traps out, as well as a couple other traps at any given time doing serious damage to bosses. You won't notice the difference. Beyond that, we're going to be filling out all of our normal jewels with life and damage stats like fizz damage, crit multi, things like that, as well as a large thread of hope over on the right side of the tree. Now, as I said before, this is the point where the build is going to start trading in defensive stats for offensive stats. It's also where going crit actually becomes worthwhile. Until this point, attempting to push crit further isn't really worth it. We grab some crit nodes simply because they're available and on the path or nearby other powerful nodes, but at this level investment we can actually start fully investing into crit. And like I said, this is where my build eventually topped out, and it was absolutely dumpstering most bosses in the game and can handle all content comfortably as long as you are comfortable with the placement of your traps. And you know some of the mechanics of the higher end bosses. Like the Feared is absolutely possible even on lower versions of this build. Depending on how the bosses spawn and what kind of RNG you get with that, it can be easier or more difficult. Now in the insane investment tier, there's only really 3 things that are going to be worthwhile besides like min-maxing your rares. The first one is going to be getting a corrupted Tinker Skin. Now you can either go for a +2 Tinker Skin or you can go for a +2/+2 Tinker Skin. But keep in mind that the corrupted Tinker Skin, if you are going the full distance with this build, is only going to be scaling the Exsanguinate, because this is the point where we're going to be trying to craft our Horror Essence meta-crafted trap gloves. Now these are insanely costly to craft simply because Horror Essences are very, very popular right now for crafting items, because you have to use Horror Essences on a pair of Shaper gloves until you land either trap and mine damage or advanced traps and no other suffix. And then beyond that, you have to use Harvest Crafting as well as suffixes can't be changed to try to apply a 70% crit multi mod to those gloves. Now that being said, these are an absolute massive upgrade, and it allows you to move your Seismic Trap into these gloves and essentially make like a 7 or 8 link. And then if you really want to go the distance, you can try to double corrupt these as well, but good luck with that. I personally didn't feel like making this jump was worthwhile. I was able to do all of the content with the previous level investment. These can cost you easily at current prices up to 40 to 50 Exalt to craft. Now beyond this, there is also the Bottled Faith, but the price of Bottled Faith is way more than what I feel that it's actually worth. It's currently like 17 or 18 Exalt right now. If you're in another league or later on where Bottled Faith is cheaper, then absolutely get that upgrade as soon as you can. It's very good the moment that you go crit. So that is pretty much going to be it for the upgrade tiers. We're going to jump into the game and take a little bit of closer look at the build, as well as show you how the build actually performs. Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Now, if you're new or part of the large percentage of people who are still not subscribed to this YouTube channel, make sure that you do that so that these videos are shown right up in your feed. And if you're enjoying the content, make sure that you like the video. Now, as for the Seismic Trapper, one of the most powerful builds this league for the amount of currency that you can invest into it. One of the biggest things about this build is that there is a build FR Totems, which I made a video about, which is absolutely overwhelming boss damage, but this build has pretty solid boss damage while absolutely being a monstrous clear build. Now, Seismic Trap in and of itself is just a trap that gives a large AoE of just little pulsing circles, and those circles can overlap. Now, the main reason why this trap in particular is so powerful is simply because the base damage of this ability scales insanely well. At level 29, we have a base damage of 23 to 3400. That is insane. Now, when we scale this with like crit and trap and mine damage and auras and all kinds of other stuff, we are just doing a ridiculous amount of damage. Now, beyond that, the build does clear with Exsanguinate. The main reason that we use Exsanguinate is simply just because it's another fizz ability. It has a ton of just clear built into the skill, and on top of that, it costs life naturally. This is actually a positive instead of a negative. So what that means is that we only have to have enough mana to throw a couple seismic traps and use like our movement skills and things like that. So when it comes to Exsanguinate, we can simply just spam these as much as we want, because anytime our traps actually do proc, we start to get some life recovery, and it's no problem whatsoever. The mana cost on our Exsanguinate traps, 123 life per throw. That's absolutely nothing to us. So it gives us essentially free clear. Beyond that, we do use these siphoning traps. These aren't really going to show you anything here. This is mainly just for getting some extra recovery from nearby enemies if you want like a little bit more regeneration, or you're worried about some degens or something like that. We use Flame Dash as our movement skill. You could potentially fit in, instead of maybe the cast when damage taken here, or you could fit it in on your weapon. You could fit in like a Fortify Whirling Blades faster attack link, but I don't exactly know how Fortify is going to be working next league for non-attack builds, so I didn't want to invest into that, but just know that you can in case that Fortify isn't absolutely killed for non-attack builds. Now, the last trap that we're using is a support trap, that is Bear Trap. This essentially just makes it so that the enemies that we hit with the Bear Trap take increased damage from hits, which is very, very nice for us. It's 25% increased damage taken, ton of extra damage. We are using a couple of auras. Those auras are going to be Pride. This is simply just extra fizz damage taken by enemies, very good. Skitterboss is going to allow us to have both chill and shock, as well as some trap and mine damage. Just a pretty solid aura for this build. Keep in mind, as far as I'm aware, Skitterbots do not allow your traps to proc twice. I know a lot of people seem to think that, but the line actually says mines detonated by Skitterbots will rearm and then can be detonated again. Doesn't say for traps. And then last, we're using War Banner. If we wanted to go a little bit further, we could drop the War Banner, get a little bit more reduction, and maybe like a Enlighten or something in the link, but Enlighten's very expensive this league, and do something like a Herald of Purity. We could also probably swap out our rings for some like Herald of Purity rings. That might be more damage, but I don't necessarily feel that it's worth it. That is pretty much all the skills that we're going to use. There's not really much else going on. We have a cast when damage taken with Immortal Call, Temporal Chains, and increased duration. This is just a nice thing to have. Like I said, you could replace this with maybe another movement ability for Fortify. Maybe you could even get Nightblade support in there if you wanted to, just for some, extra cool shenanigans and such. But let's talk about the actual gear. Now, starting from the top down, let us begin with our helmet. Now, I essentially stole this from someone. They sold this helmet as is for like 25-30C. I think that it's worth a lot more than that. I just randomly found it, the guy posted it. The goal for getting a helmet on this build should be either just buy a base with Seismic Trap releases an additional wave and craft it with essences, or craft it in however you want. Or maybe you can just find a base helmet that's good like this one. Alternatively, you could go Devouring Diadem if you wanted to go like the Aura route. That might be okay as well, but I wanted to keep some more life into my build and keep it a little bit tankier, so this is what I went with. With Devouring Diadem, you'd probably need to fit in a Desecrate with cast when damage taken or something like that, just to give it, more recovery and such, thing where it like eats the corpses around you and such. But beyond that, moving down, we are using 2 Cold Iron points. Now, these are relatively expensive this league compared to normal. They're normally like a 1 or 2 chaos item. These are currently like 15 to 20C. In a league start scenario, there is potential for these to be close to an Exalt early on. If Seismic Trap is good and people are playing like Exsanguinate type stuff, as well as any other build that goes Fizz, there's a couple different builds running around that might be, these could potentially be very expensive. We'll have to see. But by far, best weapons for the build, besides if we're going some like kind of cold conversion type of thing, these are just insanely good. The next thing is this amulet. Now, this is a +1/+1 amulet. This is ridiculously expensive right now. We do have Annihilation anointed, and the reason for that is that at this point where we're at, most bosses don't stand still long enough for increased duration to actually do anything for us. Now, I know there are a lot of people trying to scale like duration and such like that with this ability. I don't actually think that at the very high end, it is super worthwhile. Early on, when you are pathing to the left side of the tree instead, because we have Cluster Jewels now, You can see that we have 2 sets of cluster jewels here. Eventually, if I leveled up some more, I would be going like, instead of replica cheap construction here, there'd be another crit medium, and then replica cheap construction would be in there. We would go over to the left here. Now what we would do is we'd head over to the left, grab these trap nodes here, these life nodes. You could grab this crit if you really wanted to, path through here, grab this increased duration, this resist if you need it, as well as a bunch of life. That was how we were getting closer to 5k life before. And then there's also these nodes here. I'll have those 2 separate trees in the path of building, so make sure to look to that. Just keep in mind the path of building isn't going to be as extensive as in my normal build guides because this is a build workshop. So as I was saying before, we have Annihilation here. I do actually think that Arcane Potency would probably be better, but it required a silver oil. I didn't have a silver oil on me. All I had were black oils and the clear oil, so I went with Annihilation. I do think that Arcane Potency would be better. And as I said before, some people think that Exceptional Performance is better, but if you're already doing insane amounts of damage and annihilating things instantly, having the traps last an additional couple seconds won't actually do very much. Most bosses kind of move around a decent amount. For a static boss that doesn't move, that has ridiculous health, not very many of those exist, so I don't feel that it's actually that great. Next on the list is going to be Tinker Skin. This is a huge item, honestly. This item is pretty ridiculous for this build. This gives us life, cooldown recovery rate for throwing our traps, which is only really useful for like our other traps, our non-clear traps, like Seismic is the only one that really matters for it. Chance to gain frenzy charges, we do get this through the tree, so it's not super useful. The chance to gain phasing when your trap is triggered gives you perma-phasing essentially. Very, very nice, especially since flasks are not up constantly anymore. And then also recover 100 life and recover 50 energy shield when your trap is triggered by an enemy. Do keep in mind, there is a line here that says by an enemy. If you have the ascendancy that says a chain reaction, it says when your traps trigger, your nearby traps also trigger. I don't think it's worth dropping this, but do keep in mind that you're not getting the full potential of Tinker Skin because it says by an enemy. Anything that is chain reaction triggered is not going to give you that. However, I find that enough traps trigger by enemies that it is perfectly fine to keep this. 50% increased cooldown recovery rate, 50% increased AoE is not something that we can realistically drop. Not worth it whatsoever. Now, moving on, I just have a ring here with some chaos and just other resistances and some life. Once again, chaos resist. Vulnerability on hit does work with traps. I know a couple people in my chat over at twitch.tv/BigDucks, which you should go follow by the way, were saying, oh, well, how are you proccing your vulnerability on hit? Are you using it with, your flame dash? No, it procs with traps. And Exsanguinate pretty much hits the entire screen, so we pretty much curse absolutely everything. And then we have just some random boots. The increased crit strike chance if you haven't crit recently is amazing for this build later on. I suggest that you get some good boots and you go and apply this enchant. It's not that hard to get boot enchants from the lab. It took us only a few tries. If you use like the prophecy, I think that it is, twice enchanted that allows you to use multiple attempts, you should be able to get this very quickly. A random belt with good resistances in life. You could always get like a Stygian and get some kind of extra jewel that would be better than this. And then the trap gloves. Now, I do have an extra pair of trap gloves here that are a little bit better, but I couldn't really wing the resistances, unfortunately. This has cold resist, which I don't need with my current setup of gear. I needed some lightning resist. However, these gloves, I crafted both of these with essences. I got super lucky with these. This was literally like the 3rd essence that I hit. It was just the cold resistance essences, and I hit tier 1 crit multi as well as tier 1 trap. I would use these if I could, but unfortunately, I just wasn't able to wing the resistances. Now, as I said before, there is a further version of these. The way that you make them is that you're going to use Essences of Horror on Shaper Gloves, and that's going to give you plus 3.5% chance to crit on socketed gems. You keep using Essences of Horror on those gloves until you land either trap and mine damage or advanced traps, and then hopefully you have an open suffix beyond that. You do suffixes can't be changed, you harvest reroll crit, and then after you do that, you can once again do suffixes cannot be changed, and then hit it with a Veiled Chaos Orb and hope to get the plus 2 AoE enchant, and then maybe you can craft life on them. A ridiculous pair of gloves is possible for this, and then you socket in your Seismic trap in there with like advanced traps and whatever else you need for it. Would be a ridiculous damage upgrade, but insanely expensive. And that is pretty much it for the gear. As I said before, you can use a plus 2 trap and mine gems tabula early on. I was using this for a long time and we were able to kill conquerors and all kinds of stuff perfectly fine. And then as well as I added early early on. If you are able to use Atziri's Step, the chance to dodge spell hits is very, very nice for this build, but I needed their resist from the boots, so I decided to swap them out. But that is pretty much it for the gear, for the items. For the flasks, I am using an overflowing chalice just because it makes it a little bit easier to maintain flasks. There's not a ton of useful flasks for this build. I'm using a chemist quartz flask. I didn't roll any of these that well, to be honest with you. I just kind of did whatever. I have a very particular diamond flask here. It's 50% increased effect as well as crit chance during flask effect. That's one of the crafted ones that you can get later on. This is a ridiculous amount of crit. It's honestly kind of insane. And then just a chill, use when full quicksilver. You could use a bottled faith here, maybe instead of the chemist quartz flask, since we have phasing constantly from Tinkerskin, if you have 17 exalt to randomly spend on a bottled faith. But we're gonna do a map. Kind of want to show you guys what a normal map feels like on this build. This is a Maze of the Minotaur. We are on Awakener 8, and this is going to be just more rare monsters, damage, chance to gain, or chance to cause elemental ailments. Just gonna run this so I can show you what the build actually feels like. Now, when it comes to gameplay feel of the build, it's actually quite comfortable. It's a little insane how comfortable it is, actually. You throw the traps, you clear most things on the screen, and as you can see, those little vulnerability marks are going above all the enemies, so you can see that it is actually applying. But we just do ridiculous amounts of damage. Most white mobs are just getting one shot, and that's with Chain in the link. If you see a random rare mob, you can pop down a Seismic trap if you want to. It's not necessary most of the time. You can just throw a few more Exsanguinate traps if you want. But you could be a little bit safer while running this build. Keep in mind, as you do upgrade the damage, you kind of do have to drop defenses. I was close to 5k life before, and I'm down to like 4,300, so it's a little bit less tanky, but you can still just kind of go and not worry too much about it at all. The build clears absolutely excellently well. The movement speed maybe could be a little bit better, but there's not a ton that we can realistically do about that. Just get good move speed on your boots, and not much else that we can realistically do. But the main thing that this build really has is just, it does a good combo of single target as well as clear. The clear is very comfortable, the build feels very comfortable to play just in general, and when we get to the Minotaur, you'll see that as long as you do place your traps properly, the single target damage is a little silly, to be honest. Now, one thing that I said before that you can use is you can use these siphoning traps, and what the siphoning traps will do is when you toss them down, they'll give you a bit of regen, right? So as it sucks out the life from them like that, it will actually heal you during it. So maybe during a boss fight, you could pop some of those down, or, you know, if there's like a very difficult mob, or maybe you're doing like a ritual or something like that, or maybe when Ultimatum comes back, you can pop them down during Ultimatums, eventually soon TM. That's the idea. You can just pop down an extra siphoning trap. It'll give you some extra recovery. It's pretty nice. I mean, it doesn't do a ton, but it's going to give you a little bit of mana, a little bit of life, which is quite nice. Now, I don't have any portal scrolls, so let's hopefully not die on this boss, because truth be told, with this build, when you do swap over into the big damage version of it, if you do get hit really hard by the boss, you're most likely going to die. Now, with traps in particular, the thing about Seismic Trap is that if you watch where it pops, you'll notice that the middle where the Seismic Trap actually is doesn't get overlapped too much. Now, if you scaled insane AoE, you might be able to get that to work, but the best thing that you can do is say that my character is the boss, right? You want to throw them right around where the boss is going to be standing. Because if you'll notice, this spot where I'm standing is getting hit by tons of them, right? It's just going around them in an AoE. So that's the idea. So we'll go up to the boss. If we can get close to it without actually aggroing it, you can pre-throw some traps, but it doesn't look like we're able to. So we'll throw some seismics, throw some bear traps, throw some other stuff down, and you'll see that the boss pretty much melts instantly. That's the kind of damage that this build does. It's able to do most content in the game very comfortably at this gear level. Keep in mind, I'm about 20 exalt in. However, you can get 70, maybe 75% of that damage for like 5 to 10 exalt. You really don't need the extra big changes. You can get quite a bit of that damage still. The main thing is just going to be in the clusters, getting us a little bit more crit. I'm currently using Set and Forget as well as Arcane Pyrotechnics here, just because an easy way to gain Arcane Surge as well as a little bit of area, which is good for this build. Area of Effect, any source of area of effect that you can get for this build is very, very, very good. It allows those circles to overlap more. After we jump back out of the map, I will explain a little bit more of the specific mechanics here. But beyond that, we're just using pressure points, quick getaway, any crit stuff that you can get. For the fizz clusters, just master the fundamentals, because you're going to need the elemental resist, and any other 2 good damage nodes that you can possibly manage. We are also kind of using this thread of hope here. I have a very good one. I divined this randomly. But the idea is that we get a bunch of nodes. It saves us a bunch of points. We can get Expedition Munitions, Blast Cascade. We can save a point here. We can save a point here. We can save a point here. Save like 3 points here. It gets us a bunch of really good stuff for essentially nothing. But I'm gonna have to log out because I don't have any portal scrolls. So let's get back into the game. Load into the MTX shenanigans. Oh yeah, we killed Sirius, so there's not that many people here. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of this actual build because there are 2 things to keep in mind. Now, with the way that Seismic Trap works, unfortunately, it does kind of mislead you a little bit. When it says releases 6 waves every 0.6 seconds, right? When it says that, what it means, a wave is going to be the little circles that pop up when the trap goes off. It doesn't mean like pulses, right? It means that there's going to be 6 of these little circles that pop up. So what that means is that if you are using this skill and you scale the duration of it, you have the potential to have more pulses that happen, right? So it's going to have a pulse every 0.6 seconds, and the duration is 4.48. So if you get more duration on the tree, you're going to have the potential to get more pulses per trap thrown. There's 2 problems with scaling this. The first problem is that typically once you get up into the high gear levels, things die before they can even complete the pulses. You saw the Minotaur, he just kind of fell over. And the second problem, which is actually the biggest problem, is just that most in-game bosses don't stand still. They really genuinely just don't. And that is literally the only negative about this build that I was able to find. Everything else about this build is amazing. The one glaring negative of the build is when you're trying to do in-game bosses, like say Sirius in his final phase, right? He teleports and goes immune all the time. So it's super difficult because you are a cooldown-based ability to get those abilities to actually hit when they throw. There are so many times where you'll throw like 4 of your traps and think, oh yeah, I'm gonna do a ton of damage, and they'll teleport away right as the traps go off and you lose all of your damage, right? And then you gotta wait for your cooldown to come back and try throwing them again. Now, at super high gear levels, Exsanguinate actually does pretty good damage, so if you're having issues with that, just throw a bunch of Exsanguinate traps as well as bear traps. You can't lock bosses in place with the bear traps, but you can slow certain bosses with them. Depends on what boss that you're actually going against. Some can be slowed, some can't. But that's the idea. It is the one and only real problem with it. Now, when it comes to AoE, I actually did try scaling this build with Awakened AoE, and after doing a little bit of testing, it genuinely didn't feel like I was getting more overlaps with Awakened increased AoE, and that's the most AoE that I could really get out of it. It just really didn't feel like I was getting better overlaps. The gems that you're going to be using for this ability, I will have linked in the path of building, but I want to go over a little bit about what kind of gems you actually are going to be using in here. So before you get Eldritch Battery, there is kind of a problem, and that is that the Seismic Trap costs a lot of mana, and if you want to use all of your auras, we can't really sustain it. So what I was doing early on is I wasn't using crit damage support, I wasn't using critical strike support, I was using Life Tap and Hypothermia. Now you might be thinking to yourself, big ducks, you're using cold iron points and you're using Seismic Trap with brutality. How are you making use of Hypothermia? It's the Skitter Boys. Now, the Skitter Boys do chill and they do shock. So most enemies around you are going to be chilled at any given time, meaning Hypothermia is worthwhile. Once you do swap over into the crit version of the tree, you will be using crit and crit damage. You can probably go into POB and see what the exact links are going to be best for your build, but this is what I ended up with, is brutality, increased crit strike damage, advanced traps, trap and mine, and crit strikes. That is what I eventually ended up with. As well, for Exsanguinate, it's going to be Exsanguinate. The trap is given by the gloves. It is charge traps, cluster traps, as well as chain. Because we have charge traps here, it makes it so that we can throw these extremely fast when we do have our charges up. We are gaining frenzy and power charges, frenzy charges from here, as well as we do have a couple nodes in here that do provide us charges, like chance to gain a power charge when a trap is triggered by an enemy. But there is another node that we do take somewhere on the tree that does allow us to gain frenzy charges when we throw our traps. And that is going to be Master Sapper, 15% chance to gain a frenzy charge when your trap is triggered by an enemy. So technically we don't need charge traps, but it just makes the build feel better. You could do something else if you wanted to. You could do like trap and mine damage if you wanted to. I really prefer to be able to throw my traps super fast so that I don't have to worry about sitting in place for too long. It feels significantly better to just be able to go, essentially. And then we also do use Life Tap on our Flame Dash as well as our Bear Trap, as I said, most of this will be in the path of building. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, as part of these build workshops, if you have any ideas, feel free to let me know down in the comments to how I can improve this build, or if there's something that I didn't think of. There's a lot of options out there, so maybe I didn't find something, or you can join my Discord, which is linked down in the description, and you can send me a DM or talk with other people in my Discord about this build, or maybe some ideas that you had for it. I'd be happy to know. Now, this build will probably end up in a build guide, to be honest with you. It is a very, very, very powerful build. As long as GGG doesn't completely gut this build, I think it's going to be one of the more powerful starters next league. So make sure to look forward to that in the near future. So remember, boys, if you enjoy the content, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel for more content similar to this, and stay safe out there in Raid class. And I will see you guys in the next video.